Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. We're excited to start the third season. If you have been following along in the book, it's time to order a new one, available on Amazon. Or you can just follow along on the screen. And so tonight we will do a class on the Torah portion of Shmini. Shmini is the third Torah portion of the book of Leviticus. And it's also the Torah portion that we studied. This is the second week in a row that we are studying the Torah portion, because last Shabbos we did not read the Torah portion of Shmini. And the Torah, rather, we read the Torah portion associated with the holiday of Passover. And so to get right into it, we'll run through the Torah portion, a quick overview on this week's Torah portion, and then we will zero in on a unique point in this week's Torah portion. So this week's Torah portion is Shmini. Shmini, on the 8th day, following the 7 days of their inauguration, Aaron and his sons, Aaron the high priest and his sons, begin to officiate as priests. A fire issues forth from God to consume the offerings on the altar, and the divine presence comes to dwell in the sanctuary. There was much excitement, much joy, but that didn't last long, because Aaron's two elder sons, Nadav and Avihu, offer a strange fire before God, which he commanded them not to. And we will touch upon that in the class. And they die before God. Aaron is silent in the face of his tragedy. Moses and Aaron subsequently disagree as to a point of law regarding the offerings. But Moses concedes to Aaron that Aaron is in the right. The Torah portion then continues with God commanding the kosher laws, identifying the animal species permissible and forbidden for consumption. Land animals may be eaten only if they have split hooves and also chew their cud. Fish must have fins and scales. A list of non-kosher birds is given, and a list of kosher insects, 4 types of locusts, is given. Important to note that, as Rashi points out, we do not know which are the 4 types of locusts that are permitted to be eaten, which is why in the majority of Jewish communities, there are no locusts that are eaten. There is a minority of communities that feel that they do know, but again, that's a minority. And so if you see a locust, don't go and fry it. Also in Shemini are some of the laws of ritual purity, including the purifying power of the mikveh, a pool of water meeting specified qualifications, and the wellspring. Thus, the people of Israel are enjoined to differentiate between the impure and the pure. We go through life, and specifically in Judaism, in Jewish life, and we feel that there are certain concepts that inspire us, whereas there are others that don't necessarily inspire us or make us happy, to keep it lightly. There are the areas that we enjoy doing that have meaning to us, the areas, whether we're someone who enjoys the more spiritual, and so Yom Kippur is a day that uplifts us and excites us, and we're excited to keep away from the more mundane aspects of life, stay locked up in the synagogue for an entire day. And then there are those of us who like the more tangible mitzvahs of enjoying a holiday meal. There are those who would enjoy the commandment of only eating kosher, and then there are those who find that as quite a burden. And so when it comes to these various levels of Judaism, we really have them in 2 different categories. And each person, these categories vary. But the 2 categories are, there's the appealing mitzvahs and the unappealing, the ones which we find exciting and motivating, the ones which we don't necessarily. There are 2 reactions that we may have. We may have a reaction of rejection. I'm going to pick and choose. I'm not going to do the mitzvahs I don't enjoy. I'm going to do the mitzvahs that I do enjoy. And it's not necessarily hard or easy. They could be hard mitzvahs, but I enjoy them. It could be an easy mitzvah that I don't enjoy, and so I won't do it. And then there are those among us who have acceptance as the response. We do it. That's what God wants. I don't enjoy it. I'm going to do it anyhow because that's what I'm supposed to do. It's a package deal. Judaism is a package deal. You win some, you lose some. Some of them I enjoy, some of them I don't. Both these approaches are really the same. What they're actually conveying is the idea that whether or not we actually go ahead and do the mitzvah, in the first reaction, they don't do the mitzvah. In the second, the mitzvah is done, but the reaction is the same, that we dislike this mitzvah. We don't see it motivating, we don't see it purposeful, we don't find it meaningful, and it may even lead us to a certain level of frustration. So basically, we know how to do or not do something that we really dislike, but the question is, can we learn to love something that we hate? Can we learn to love to do something and love the action that we're doing, even if it's something that we really dislike, even if it's something that we really get frustrated about? When it comes to the way Judaism sees this idea of pick and choose, surprisingly, it seems to lend itself to have that possibility in certain instances to pick and choose. For example, according to Jewish law, a baby boy born has to be circumcised on the 8th day, right? We know that that's a positive commandment, that's an active commandment, it's something which is actionable and something which we are commanded to do. But we have another commandment. That is that we have to keep Shabbos holy, and part of Shabbos are a number of prohibitions and positive commandments, among which is a commandment that we are not allowed to inflict a wound on Shabbos. So what happens if the 8th day of a baby's birth happens on a Shabbos? And do we follow the positive command, the action command of circumcising the child? Or do we say, no, it's Shabbos, there is a passive command of not to inflict a wound on Shabbos. Circumcision is inflicting a wound, however noble, however important, however divine, it's still inflicting a wound. So which mitzvah supersedes the other? And according to Jewish law, the active mitzvah supersedes the passive mitzvah. The positive, actionable mitzvah supersedes the passive, negative prohibition. And so, as we know, and some of you may have been at the 8th day of a baby boy on Shabbos, a bris is performed on Shabbos. In the words of the Talmud, text 1. Reish Lakish said, in a situation where an active and passive mitzvah coincide, if it is possible to fulfill both, that is ideal. If not, let the active mitzvah override the passive mitzvah. And one of the reasons for this is very simple. Let's look at it from a psychological perspective. From a psychological perspective, we take more pleasure, more meaning, more purpose in action, in doing something, in action. Sorry? We take more pleasure in actionable mitzvahs. We take less pleasure in passive mitzvahs. We're not doing anything. We don't see the accomplishment. We don't see a tangible accomplishment in a passive mitzvah. Whereas when it comes to an action, we enjoy it much more. And so some give the reason for this rule that we follow the active mitzvah when it coincides with a passive mitzvah. We follow the active mitzvah over the passive because there's more excitement to it, there's more pleasure in it, there's more meaning, there's more of a sense of fulfillment. Now, it's important to note that, as mentioned here by Reish Lakish, it is only when it is impossible to fulfill both. We can't say, you know what, there's an active mitzvah to put on tefillin, there's a passive mitzvah of not eating a BLT sandwich. I'm going to put on tefillin, which is the active mitzvah, and so I can go ahead and eat a BLT sandwich because that's a passive mitzvah. It's possible to fulfill both. One doesn't override the other. If it's impossible, like in this case, the 8th day is Shabbos, it's one or the other, then you follow the passive over the active. The reasoning, as explained in the words of Nachmanides, the famed 13th century sage, Rabbi Nachman. The truth is that the mitzvah of remembrance is an active mitzvah, which is done out of love and leads to compassion. Mitzvah of remembrance is a reference to the mitzvah he's talking about, the mitzvah of Shabbos. In Shabbos, we have two mitzvahs. To remember the Shabbos, those are all the action mitzvahs. That's the general rule of the action mitzvahs on Shabbos. And then there's the mitzvah of guarding Shabbos, which is the general category of the passive mitzvahs on Shabbos, the prohibitions of Shabbos, guarding the Shabbos. And so he explains that the mitzvah of remembrance is an active mitzvah which is done out of love and leads to compassion. Because one who does the command of their master loves him, and his master has compassion on him. The mitzvah to guard is a passive mitzvah similar to the trait of judgment, which stems from fear. Because one who abstains from doing something bad in the eyes of his master is afraid of him. Therefore, an active mitzvah is greater than a passive mitzvah, the same way love is greater than fear. One who fulfills the desire of his master physically and monetarily is greater than one who abstains from doing something wrong in his eyes. So what we see here, thus the halachic rule is that an active mitzvah overrides a passive mitzvah. So what we see here is that in some cases, following halacha, Judaism recognizes that some mitzvahs can be more satisfying than others, and therefore, if it comes to a head and we have a choice, one or the other, we choose the seemingly more satisfying mitzvah over the less satisfying mitzvah. But the question really is, how can we learn to appreciate all godly directives, all the mitzvahs, not just the ones that we enjoy, the ones that we find pleasurable? Is it possible? And so that's where our Torah portion comes in. And our Torah portion, one incident in this week's Torah portion, will provide insight to this question. So we'll begin from the beginning of the story. The end of the middle and the end of the book of Exodus, we were talking about the construction of the Mishkan, construction of the tabernacle. They worked hard, they collected all the materials, and they went ahead and they built the tabernacle. They completed the building of the tabernacle, and they were told that it should be built and finalized on the first day of the month of Nisan. They had 7 days of preparation, practice, and then they had the inauguration on the 8th day. It was a joyous occasion. They worked, they toiled, they collected, they built, they practiced. A lot of hard work, a lot of energy, a lot of anticipation, and as we discussed in weeks prior, a lot of hope that this building of the tabernacle will finally cause the divine presence to be in a greater revealed manner in this physical world than it is generally, and that it will be a sign that God has forgiven the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. And what happens? The fateful day arrives. They built the tabernacle. They start servicing. Text 3, book of Leviticus. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, an alternate name for the tabernacle. Then they came out and blessed the people. And here's the moment everyone was waiting for. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. It was a moment of joy. It was such intense joy. Here's in the words of the Talmud how intense the joy was, not just by the Jewish people for their handiwork being received by the Almighty with a divine presence resting in it, but it was a moment of joy for the Almighty. The words of the Talmud, and it came to pass, Vayehi is the word that is used in the verse, the first word of this week's Torah portion. Vayehi, and it came to pass on the 8th day. It is taught in a Braita, which is a tradition in the Jewish oral law not incorporated in the Mishnah. On that day, there was joy before the Holy One, blessed be He, similar to the joy that existed on the day on which the heavens and earth were created. It is written here with regard to the dedication of the tabernacle, and it came to pass, Vayehi, on the 8th day, And it is written there in the creation story, and it was Vayehi, evening, and it was morning one day. So we are associating the creation, the joy that God felt with the creation of the world, with the joy that God had with the creation of the tabernacle. That's how exciting it was. This is the first time that there was a permanent dwelling for the Almighty in the physical world. This is the time when the Jewish people's handiwork, months and months of building and of toiling, finally paid off, and they have God in their presence, in their hand. The joy was palpable. The happiness, the excitement, the emotions were high. But unfortunately, tragedy struck. Continuing in this week's Torah portion. On that day, Torah tells us, and Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his pan, put fire in it, and placed incense upon it. And they brought before God foreign fire, which he had not commanded. They brought an incense offering into the tabernacle, which God did not command them to bring. And fire went forth from before God and consumed them, and they died before God. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what God spoke when he said, I will be sanctified through those near to me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron was silent. Tragedy. Nadav and Avihu, the high priest's sons, eldest sons, Moses' nephews. The entire Jewish people are in joyous celebration of this tremendous moment, historical moment, of the divine glory resting in the temple, the divine presence finally resting in their handiwork. They die. What happens? We're not going to get deeply into the story itself on why they died or how it happens. We've discussed that at length elsewhere. We've discussed that at length in the past. And there are various commentaries that explain exactly what their sin was and how they died. But we're going to focus on a large and very practical problem. There's this auspicious celebration going on. Who's going to bury them? We have two people who just died in the tabernacle. Who's going to pick them up, remove them from the tabernacle and bury them? And the Torah tells us, it's not just any people that were tasked with burying them. Moses calls to their cousins, two Levites, and he tells them, go in and remove your cousins and take care of their birth. The words of this week's Torah portion. And Moses summoned Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Aaron's uncle Uziel, Moses and Aaron's first cousins, Nadav and Avihu, first cousins once removed. So they are first cousins once removed of the deceased. And Moses tells them, draw near, carry your kinsmen from within the sanctuary to the outside of the camp. So they approached and carried them with their tunics to the outside of the camp as Moses had spoken. The Torah makes a deliberate point to tell us who was appointed to bury Nadav and Avihu. And it's a strange choice at that. Here's this joyous celebration. Here's the moment of the completion of the temple, the tabernacle, and who serves in the tabernacle? The priests, the Kohanim, and the Levites. Seemingly, they would be the most joyous and the most involved in this celebration because this is their workplace. This is their tabernacle. This is where they will serve the Almighty on behalf of the Jewish people. Couldn't Moses have taken someone else? Asked a number of Israelites or a little bit more removed? Maybe if you're going to ask Levites, it shouldn't be cousins, although all the Levites were cousins. So don't ask the cousins, don't ask the Levites. A, because they're cousins. B, because this is their day of celebration. Why specifically choose their cousins to carry out the burial? To understand this, let's take a step back. And with this, we will answer our initial question, the first question, which is, how do we get ourselves to be excited and happy and to enjoy all the commandments, even the ones we seemingly do not enjoy? So to understand this, let's put ourselves in the perspective of what's going on with the Jewish people in the desert at that moment. It's a situation that the Jews were facing at that moment. Imagine it's your child's wedding. It's a joyous day. There's lots going on. And a piece of jewelry goes missing. What's going to happen? If it wasn't an ordinary day, you take that day, you take that thought, and you'd work on it to go ahead and suppress that thought. Sorry, if it's an ordinary day, you'd work on that day, on that thought, to go ahead and find the piece of jewelry that's missing. You'd spend hours. It's an important piece. It's somewhat expensive. But now on the day of your daughter's wedding, your son's wedding, of your child's wedding, you wanted to stay focused on this joyous occasion. You don't want that to ruin the entire celebration. This is what was going on over here. In the words of Rashi, text 5c, carry your kinsman from within the sanctuary, etc., as a person who would say to his fellow when someone had died at a wedding feast, remove the deceased from before the bride so as not to disturb the joyous occasion. Here too, Mishal and Al-Tzafan were to remove the dead from inside the sanctuary so as not to disturb the serenity of the investitures of the sanctuary. For the Jewish people celebrating the inaugural moment of the Mishkan, it was a bittersweet moment. Instead of being able to focus on this massive accomplishment, on this historical moment, they were faced with this darker issue of Nadav and Avihu, tragically, suddenly passing. And no less in the new Mishkan itself that they're all celebrating. And so here a decision had to be made. What's the focus of this day? What are we going to make the focus of this day? And so what does Moshe do? He steps in, Moses steps in, and he arranges for the bodies to be removed discreetly, carry them out, and let the festivities continue. Because this day will be all about the new mission. We're not saying that these souls are not important. They're going to be mourned, and they were mourned at the appropriate time and in the appropriate way of mourning. On that day, they weren't. The mourning was pushed off. It wasn't eliminated. So removing the bodies wasn't just removing the bodies. Removing the bodies was about preserving the joyous meaning of the day, the joyous atmosphere. And as such, not only isn't asking Mishal and Al-Tzafan cousins and Levites to ask it, a deviation from what would fit, but it's actually the perfect choice of someone to carry out that task of providing for the joyous atmosphere to continue. A Levite is a perfect choice because he understands the importance of the joy. He understands he is deeply connected with the tabernacle. He deeply feels the joy of the occasion, the need for the joyous atmosphere. And so he will do his best to discreetly remove them in a way that it should not disturb the atmosphere. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, that is actually part of their job description. The Levite's job was to stand guard over the tabernacle. That's what the Levite's job was. Most of the Levites did their job in a very conventional way. On that day, they were serving the temple. They were rejoicing. Mishal and Al-Tzafan did it in a very unconventional way. but they did their job as a Levite as well, encouraging the joyous atmosphere and contributing to it. In the words of the Rebbe, burying the deceased was not an active, positive service like singing in the Mishkan. Rather, it was a negative action, removing items that would disrupt the Mishkan service. So it's part of their job. It was part of the Levites' job. And this explains why Moses chose specifically Levites to go ahead and do it. Granted, the action itself is very different than the action that the other Levites were tasked with. The other Levites, they enjoyed the task that they were handed. The task was to serve in the temple, to be joyous on this celebratory day. Mishal and Atzafim were given a less than enjoyable task, sad task, a hard task, to remove them, to bury them, but it was a divine task nonetheless. How were Mishal and Atzafim able to find meaning in that task? Were they able to find meaning in that task? Were they able to go ahead and find purpose in the sad task of removing their cousins, Nadav and Aviv? And here's where we go to the key point. And how it relates to us very literally. On a smaller scale, we know that we're not enjoying a specific mitzvah. We know that. We understand that. Mishal and Atzafim were probably not enjoying or taking pleasure in that mitzvah in a narrow sense, and that directive from Moses in a narrow sense. But that's how we have to broaden the lens. We have to look at it from a bigger picture. Take Mishal and Atzafim. In the narrow lens, they were burying their cousins, they were burying the dead on this joyous day. It was disrupting their own joy. But if you broaden their lens, they were accomplishing something tremendous. It was because of them that millions of other Jews were able to enjoy the joyous atmosphere. In other words, their action is what caused this joyous atmosphere to persevere. The preservation of the joy of that day was only because of Mishal and Atzafim's discrete actions. And so looking at it from a narrow lens, Mishal and Atzafim can say, hey, I don't enjoy doing this. This is boring. This is lame. This is sad. This is tragic, unfortunate. I don't find pleasure in doing it. But looking at it from a broader lens, they were able to see the larger picture, the big picture. That because of this discrete action, because of what they're doing, the joyous atmosphere continued. And everyone enjoyed the moment the way it was meant to be. Take, for example, an emergency responder, one who's on call. You have in Jewish communities, you have the Hatzalah services, if you've heard of it, which are ordinary people, doctors, lawyers, storekeepers, cashiers, rabbis, whoever it may be, who join an EMS service, a volunteer EMS service. They get calls at all times of day and night. They stop what they're doing and they run to go help. Imagine a medic lying in bed. His kids kept him up. He's got 6 kids at home. They kept him up one after the next. It's 3:30. He finally shut his eyes. And not 20 minutes goes by, there's a call that comes in. Jumps out of bed, running down the stairs, stubs his toe, jumps into his car, runs to the emergency, and takes care of whatever the emergency is. There's a smaller picture. He had 20 minutes of sleep. He's wiped. He's tired. He's uninterested. He stubbed his toe. Really hurts, especially at 4 a.m. For those of us who stubbed our toes at 4 a.m, it feels like the end of the world. He's got to get to work in 2 hours. He's really not enjoying it. Then there's the bigger picture. He may have saved someone's life. He's helping someone. Not only someone, he's helping the community at large. He's making a difference in this world. That enables him, with the correct focus, to even enjoy the moments along the way. That's exactly what Mishal and Al-Tzafan are doing, in the words of the Rebbe. It emerges that in doing this service, Mishal and Al-Tzafan were not removed from rejoicing in the Mishkan. Taking Nadav and Avihu out of the Mishkan was how they took part in the Simcha, in the joyous occasion. That's how they did it. They were a tremendous part of it. Looking at it from the bigger perspective, from the bigger picture. It was an interesting service that took place in the temple. The service was called Haramas Hadeshin, Trumas Hadeshin. Trumas Hadeshin literally was taking out the trash. The glorious sounding Hebrew words, Trumas Hadeshin, lifting of the ashes, but it was taking out the trash, quite literally. The altar was a big place, as we once discussed, not the specific measurements, but generally speaking, the altar was a huge edifice. It was about 50 feet by 50 feet by about 18 feet tall. That's how big the top of the altar was. And there was a constant run of sacrifices. There was a lot of ashes. Those ashes were removed, placed at the side of the temple. Once it was on the side of the altar. And every day, I believe it was every day, there was someone who was tasked with taking those ashes out of the area, out of the holy temple. What would you call such a person? He's got to schlep the ashes out of the temple. He's taking out the garbage. Is taking out the garbage something to get excited about? Is taking out the garbage something to feel special about? Or is taking out the garbage just taking out the garbage? Do you feel special when you take the garbage out of your home? Or do you feel special when you finally build your home? When you cook a dinner? When you bring home a paycheck so you can feed your family? But the Torah tells us something different. In the words of Maimonides, the laws governing the removal of the ashes, text 8, lifting the ashes from the altar is an active mitzvah, as it says, he shall lift up the ashes. This job is a priestly job. It's not just a job for anyone. Only a priest was allowed to do it. And how do we do this job? How is this job done? One who merited to raise the ash, keyword, merited to raise the ash. Wasn't taken out the trash. It was a merit to raise the ash. Must immerse in a mikveh. He had to go into a mikveh and prepare himself ritually, refine himself. And he would wear special garments, clothing for lifting. There were special garments. He also cleans his hand and feet in preparation for this mitzvah. The one performing this mitzvah of raising the ashes had to have a wide lens perspective. In doing this mitzvah, he understands and he recognizes that this is part of the service in the Holy Temple. And so anything which is done in the Holy Temple is holy. In the words of Rabbeinu Bachya, great sage, 13th century sage who we've quoted in the past, he explains the following. We learn that even when it comes to the mitzvah of removing the ashes from the altar, which would seem to be a light mitzvah, put lightly, God instructed us to honor the mitzvah. It is performed by the Kohen who is dressed in the priestly vestments. This demonstrates a general approach anyone who wishes to come close to God ought to assume. Whatever it is that he or she is doing, if it is for God, they ought to regard it with much honor, being humble in the face of God, whom they are honoring. This approach applies to even the lightest of all modes of service. Anything can be enjoyable, anything can be pleasurable if there's significantly powerful meaning behind it. And yes, there's tremendous meaning behind the raising of the ashes. This is servicing God's temple. This is servicing the Almighty. A child enjoys only what's in front of them. They enjoy a lollipop, they enjoy a toy, they enjoy the little things. But as we get older and as we mature, we can recognize that there's enjoyment in things that aren't on their own necessarily enjoyable, but with the broader lens, they offer a lot of enjoyment. Using the example of the Hatzalah, an emergency response member, he doesn't necessarily enjoy stubbing his toe, but following and focusing on the meaning and purpose behind it with a true broad mind can enable them to feel pleasure even within the process, because he's mentally focused on the goal. And whatever takes him to that goal is all enjoyable. How does that translate into our initial question? Our initial question of how do we enjoy the mitzvah? When we come to a mitzvah that we don't necessarily enjoy, that we don't necessarily find pleasurable, that we don't necessarily find exciting or meaningful, analyze the mitzvah. Analyze an aspect of the mitzvah that we do enjoy. If we can't find an aspect within the mitzvah, how about something about mitzvahs in general? I'm doing something for the Almighty. The Almighty wants me to do something. He wants to connect with me. Hey, David, can you do me a favor? God's saying. I want you, right? The posters, Uncle Sam wants you. God wants you. So it may not be something in the specific mitzvah that you're enjoying, but it's the general idea. It's the broader lens. There's a tremendous goal. When we focus on that aspect of the mitzvah, that enables us to have more excitement. And getting back to the passive versus the active mitzvahs, when it comes to the active mitzvahs, we're more excited about it by them. When it comes to the passive mitzvah, maybe not so much. But the passive mitzvahs are just as important. And in a powerful metaphor used by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, text 10, he explains this concept beautifully. When a human king wishes to occupy a pleasant living space, he first instructs the chambers to be cleared from all filth and disarray, and thereafter nice furniture, bed, table, chair, and lamp are brought in. So it is in our religious life, as it is stated, and God placed Adam in Gan Eden to work and guard it. Our sages explain to work it, these are the active mitzvahs, to guard it, these are the passive mitzvahs. In other words, the passive mitzvahs function to eradicate all evil so that there should not be any filth. The active mitzvahs are analogous to placing nice furniture in the house, namely, they fulfill the purpose of creation, to fashion a home for God in the corporeal worlds. Every single aspect of the mitzvahs is us building a dwelling place for the Almighty. It's us building that relationship with the Almighty. That is the broader picture. Rabbi Nachman Sudak the first Chabad emissary to England, the Rebbe, who's passed away. Rabbi Nachman Sudak passed away a number of years ago. His son, Rabbi Levi Sudak, the Chabad emissary to Edgware in the UK, related that when his father was awarded with an OBE from the Queen, his father went to the palace together with all the other people and his little entourage of people, together with all the other ones who were honored with an OBE. They were walking in the hallways inside the palace, and Rabbi Sudak noticed a tissue that was lying on the floor. So he bent down to pick it up. And before he had a chance to pick it up, one of the royal guards came over and says, "No, sir. This is the palace. Only the royal guards, only Her Majesty's servants may clean it." And the guard proceeded to pick up the tissue and put it in the trash. And Rabbi Sudak said that it gave him a tremendous perspective and inspiration for this exact concept. It's garbage, but it's in Her Majesty's palace. And so only Her Majesty's servants can be the one to clean it. We are in the Almighty's palace. We are in God's world. We are God's servants. We are the ones that God tasked with keeping this world a holy place, making this world a godly place, making this world a holy place. It's up to us to do every aspect, even if it means something that to us looks like picking up garbage, that to us looks like it's those passive commandments, the ones we don't enjoy. It's the housekeeping commandments. As the Alter Rebbe just explained, the negative commandments are those housekeeping commandments. They're the ones that empty the world of the filth in order that the godly furniture can be brought in. The world can be made into a godly abode, dwelling place for the Almighty. But it's a service of God nonetheless. And so this story of Mishal and El-Tzafan is the story of every single one of us. Because Maimonides writes famously that any person whose heart desires can become like a Levite, can serve as God like a Levite, can serve God in the Levite manner. And so just as these two Levites were able to perform these seemingly mundane or sad or unexciting tasks, but it was part of, and they felt it to be part of the overall celebration, so too, we can fulfill every single one of our tasks when we see it from the broader picture. When we go through life, there are ups and downs. When we go through life, there are challenges that seem that are insurmountable. Or when we go through life, we see challenges to our daily plans. There's a famous general who once said that no plans survive first contact with reality. Right? It's not just you. When you had a daily plan and it went in disarray, it's not just you. It happens to everyone. Every plan is going to hit hiccups. Every plan is going to hit bumps in the road. Every idea, we wanted to do this, it didn't work out. I wanted to do that, it didn't work out. When we hit those bumps, that is the way it was meant to be. This is the way God wanted us to serve him, in those various ways. To us, it may seem like that it's something that's small and insignificant, but it's just as important. And using that broader lens that we all have, we can have that same excitement in those moments. In the words of the Baal Shem Tov, text 11. A person must be devoted to God with all his or her might, for everything is for the sake of the one above. God wishes that we dedicate ourselves to him in every which way. So at times a person may be walking and will bump into someone and they end up speaking, making it impossible to study Torah at that time. At that time, the person must still remain completely devoted to God in his or her mind, affecting spiritual results. Similarly, when a person is traveling and unable to study Torah to pray, or to pray as they would like, that means they must serve God in different ways. Do not be troubled by this, for God wants you to serve him in all sorts of ways, times like this, other times like that. And therefore, he orchestrated events to compel you to travel or speak with others so that you can serve him in an alternate fashion. In short, we have to get on the train of Al-Tzafan and Mishal and Al-Tzafan. We have to follow their path. And there's a story which I've related once or twice, but it expresses this idea beautifully. The famed two brothers, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk and Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli. They were once wrongfully accused and they were thrown into prison. And Rabbi Elimelech stood up to do the afternoon prayers. Stands up to do the afternoon prayers. And his brother Rabbi Zusha turns to him and says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm standing up to daven mincha." He says, "You can't daven. In the center of the room is the bucket. It's a bathroom here. According to Jewish law, in a bathroom, one is not allowed to pray." He says, "With the pail, with the bucket in the middle of the room, there's no way we can go ahead and daven mincha and do the afternoon services." And so Rabbi Elimelech sat down, deeply upset that he would not be able to daven. Started crying. So Rabbi Zusha turns to him, his brother turns to him, the same brother told him he can't daven. And Rabbi Zusha turns to him and says, "What are you crying about?" He says, "What do you mean, what am I crying about? I'm crying that I can't daven mincha, I can't do my afternoon services." He says, "So what are you crying about?" The same God who told us that we should do the afternoon services, that we should pray the afternoon services, also told us that if there's a bucket as such in this room, we are not allowed to pray the afternoon services. So just as by praying we would be filling a commandment and there's joy in every commandment, so too by not praying, we are fulfilling a commandment of God. And there's joy in that too. Let's dance. And so Zusha and Elimelech, they get up in the middle of this room, surrounded by criminals. There's a pail of bathroom in the center of the room, and they start dancing, and they're joyous. And they start dancing, and all the other inmates who are sitting there in that big room, they figured, hey, there's a party. Let's dance too. And everyone starts dancing, and it becomes a joyous occasion. The wardens, the prison guards come running. And they see everyone's dancing, and they can't take it. And they start asking around, what's going on? Why are you dancing? They say, I don't know. We're dancing because those two Jews in the middle, they're dancing. We're dancing from their joy. So he says, what are they dancing about? So the inmates say, we don't know. They were pointing at this bucket. It's something to do with the bucket. They're very excited. So the prison guard says, the bucket is making them happy. The bucket is making them dance. I'm going to take the bucket out of the room. And he went ahead and removed the bucket from the room. And Melech and Zusha were not able to daven mincha. It's all about the perspective, but it's all about the wider lens that we have. The same God who commanded us to pray also told us that it has to be clean. And so at every moment, at every mitzvah, we have to stop and say, let's look beyond that uncomfortability or that frustration or dullness I may have associated with that mitzvah, and look at the bigger picture and say, what's my part in the bigger scheme of things? In the broader lens of fulfilling the divine commandments that's before me. How am I going to make the world a better place by doing this mitzvah?